Was Jesus a socialist?
How bad could it be?
To help the poor, would Jesus prefer that you give your money freely to the Salvation Army, for example?
The Salvation Army has delivered a formal apology to those mistreated in its care.
They were meant to protect the most vulnerable children. Instead, they were responsible for some of the most shocking child abuse ever seen in Australia.
In an interview with two gay journalists, the Salvation Army official by the name of Andrew Crabe confirmed that the Salvation Army believes homosexuals deserve death.
We begin in Saanich, where holiday cheer was temporarily replaced with shock after a sign telling people not to donate popped up in the last place you would expect it, over the shoulders of a volunteer working for the Salvation Army.
Or have it taxed by politicians to fund a welfare bureaucracy?
Okay. So I guess I'm making a PragerU video then.
Watch this.
This PragerU video is about a year old, so I'm kinda late to the party, but after looking at some of the excellent responses that have already been made, I think I still have something to contribute to this conversation. I haven't seen an analysis of this video from a Christian perspective yet, and I think that when you look at it from that perspective, some really weird things start to pop out about this video and, by extension, much of PragerU's other content. See, I have a lot of experience discussing this exact subject with conservative Christians, and the arguments I see in this video don't, by and large, actually reflect the arguments I tend to hear in defense of capitalism from those conservative Christians. In fact, I showed this video to a small sampling of conservative Christians that I know, both in person and online, and the consensus was that these arguments were bad and made evangelicals look like idiots who don't actually know what's in their Bibles. These are people who agree with many of Prager's political views, and even still maintain enough cognitive dissonance to believe that Jesus wasn't explicitly anti-wealth. But the specific arguments being presented in this video are simply so blatantly dishonest that any confirmation bias that may have otherwise had them nodding along was just easily overcome by the simple fact that they know what their Bible says. This made me wonder who the target audience of these videos is, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But first, let's take a look at this video so you can see what I mean here. I feel like we should all be able to skip this first part by now, but we can't, until this information either becomes common knowledge or PragerU stops spreading bullshit. So to reiterate what most of you probably already know, because some of you may not, PragerU, as usual, has no idea what socialism is.
To get an accurate answer to our question, we need to define socialism. Socialism is the concentration of power into the hands of government elites to achieve the following purposes: central planning of the economy and the radical redistribution of wealth. Jesus never called for any of that.
Putting aside this dishonest tactic of applying a narrow definition that would be completely anachronistic if applied to the time of Jesus, this definition is just wrong. Capitalism is the system where a few elites control everything. Socialism, as most of you are likely aware, is defined by the communal control over the means of production, distribution, and exchange. This communal control can either be direct or through a properly accountable intermediary, like an elected government or a trade union. Also inherent to the idea of transitioning from a capitalist to a socialist society is the redistribution of wealth, as much of the wealth of the capitalist class is tied up in their ownership of the means of production, which is now, in one way or another, owned communally. This means that the associated wealth is also distributed communally, just as a consequence of the new ownership structure. In an anarchist context, the goal isn't just to increase worker control, but to flatten hierarchy wherever possible. So the redistribution of wealth, already vital in a socialist context, is focused on to an even greater degree in an anarchist context. As many watching this video are already aware, I think there is an extremely strong case to be made that Jesus was not only, to the degree that anyone could be at the time, socialist, but anarchist, and that this is reflected in the way that he said an ideal society should be constructed and how early Christian churches were organized. But my goal isn't really to convince you of that in this video. Instead, I hope to prove to you that PragerU is just not to be trusted, regardless of your political views. After failing to define socialism, The video goes on to babble about Rockefeller's charitable donations.
John D. Rockefeller probably gave away more money than anyone in human history, and he was certainly a capitalist.
Which is really dumb, but not what I want to focus on here. If you want an idea of what Jesus would think about these donations, I recommend taking a look at Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44, also known as the widow's offering or the widow's 2 coins. But suffice it to say that I don't think you would be impressed. But the next part of the video is where it gets really interesting. Here's where they actually try to dive into the Bible. First, our failed hybrid of Mike Pence and Chris Matthews here points out this one time when Jesus rebuked someone for asking him to try to litigate a land dispute between himself and his brother. Because capitalism?
In Luke 12, Jesus is confronted by a man who wants him to redistribute wealth. "Master," the man says to Jesus, "tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replies, "Man, who made me a judge or divider over you?" And then he rebukes the man for being envious of his sibling.
Now, even if we knew nothing else about this passage, it's sort of a strange choice as a starting point for an argument about the biblical basis for capitalism. Because even if taken at face value, all it establishes is that Jesus didn't think he was qualified to resolve land disputes. When you actually look at the Bible passage, though, it becomes an even weirder choice. The section that this passage comes from, in my Bible, is labeled the Parable of the Rich Fool, and goes as follows. A man cried out from the crowd while Jesus was preaching and said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide our father's inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Friend, who made me a judge over you to decide such things as that?" Okay, so far so good. What comes next? Then he said, "Beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own." He then goes on to tell a story about a rich man who got very, very wealthy, so wealthy that he had no more room to store his wealth. So he built bigger storehouses and rested on his laurels, happy that he was now comfortable for life. Then he died that same night, so all his hoarding was completely pointless. This passage, the passage literally used as the first example for why Jesus would have supported capitalism, is a polemic about the dangers of greed and the banality of the drive to hoard wealth. If one were to bother to crack open a Bible and check to see if the text supports the PragerU position, it's literally undermined the line after Chris Pence cuts off the quote in the video. It's not just an aside either. Jesus goes on to rant for several more verses about how it's sinful to hoard money and those who have excess should be giving that excess to the poor. It's literally about the single worst example PragerU could possibly have given to support this position. And this was their first one. This isn't unusual either. Pretty much every example given in this video can be undermined the same way. Let's move on to his next example, the parable of the talents, which you can find in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 28.
A man entrusted 3 of his workers with his wealth. The 2 who invested the money and made a profit were praised, and the one who buried his share so he wouldn't lose any of it was reprimanded. Sounds a lot more like an endorsement for capitalism than socialism, doesn't it?
Now, as with the previous example, taking this as an endorsement of capitalism, or any system of government for that matter, is a really weird take. This parable is one that I don't really like for completely different reasons, but even under the most stretched possible interpretation, it has nothing to do with capitalism. It's almost as if it was only chosen because it has a denomination of currency in the name. The parable of the talents is part of a long sermon Jesus gives to his disciples in chapters 24 and 25 of the book of Matthew, and it concerns what the end of the world will look like. The main thrust of every one of the parables given in this sermon is, get right with God now because the end could come at any time and by then it'll be too late. This parable is no different. It ends not just with the landowner reprimanding the servant, but casting him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. See, because the landowner in this scenario is God, and they weren't talking about actual money, but like righteousness or faith or prayers or predestination credits or whatever form any particular branch of Christianity thinks the magic karma points that get you into heaven take. By taking this parable as a literal endorsement of capitalism, Wonder Bread here is, by extension, placing capitalists in the position of God, and claiming they should have the power to cast their servants into the fire for being too poor, which is... yikes. Also, if you read just a little bit further and finish this chapter, you get my favorite line in the book of Matthew, which describes how Jesus will know who to embrace and who to rebuke when the time comes. For I was hungry, and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, and you didn't give me a drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't invite me into your home. I was naked, and you didn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me. When you refused to help the least of my brothers and sisters, you were refusing to help me. This is far from an endorsement of capitalism. In fact, it seems to indicate that Jesus advocated for a mutualist collectivist society where we all help one another, and actively condemned the sort of radical self-interest that capitalism relies on. Weird. Anyone who's read the New Testament will have a hard time denying that Jesus advocated for the wealthy to give up their wealth. However, the argument that Jesus only condemned the love of money, and not the acquisition and hoarding of money itself, a position that I think this video's previous examples have already undermined, is actually a pretty common one. Unlike the previous two examples, which just seem to be pulled from Prager's fever dreams, this one is actually argued by conservative Christians when trying to defend capitalism. However, the way that it gets done here is somewhat odd, so let's watch the clip.
Yes, Jesus spoke of the difficulty for a rich man to enter heaven, but not because having money is evil. It's not money, rather it is the love of money, the New Testament tells us, that leads to evil. Jesus was warning us not to put acquisition of money and material possessions above our spiritual and moral lives.
So, with regards to a rich man having a difficult time entering heaven, he's clearly talking about the famous eye of the needle passage here, so let's take a look at that passage. Jesus told him, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and then you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. When the young man heard this, he went away in sorrow, because he had great wealth. Then Jesus said to his disciples, Truly I tell you, it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. For it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. The video then goes on to say that it's merely the love of money that's the root of all evil, not money itself. But that isn't what's said here. The phrase, the love of money is the root of all evil, is in the Bible, in its own context, over in 1 Timothy. But it's not present anywhere even close to the vicinity of this story, and isn't used to justify wealth in its own context either. In fact, Jesus is quite clear that this man needs to sell his possessions and give to the poor, not just tell people he doesn't like money that much, or donate 0.05% of that money to a museum, or whatever it is people think makes good billionaires. Jesus told him that, to enter the kingdom, he needs to put his money where his mouth is, so to speak, and prove he doesn't love money more than life by voluntarily ceasing to be rich so that others can have enough. Most evangelicals I know won't even try to make this weird point that rich people don't actually love their money when trying to defend capitalism in the face of these lines, but instead will defer to the next couple of lines in this chapter. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished and asked, Who then can be saved? Jesus looked at them and said, With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. See, evangelicals take the position that faith is the most important thing. So yeah, greed is bad and most billionaires are greedy, but since faith is what really matters, if their faith is strong enough, they can overcome that greed without giving up their money somehow. I think this argument's dumb as hell, but at least it has something to do with the text. In fact, with the exception of that weak-ass love of money argument, nothing presented in this video even actually reflects what conservative Christians tend to argue when asked this question. When watching this, I was amazed they didn't dip into the blatant bootlicking present in Romans 13, which states in no uncertain terms that the people who are rich and powerful deserve to be because they're favored by God. Or what about Galatians 6, which states again in no uncertain terms that each man should carry his own load. The Bible is a complicated text written by a bunch of different people. They didn't always agree with each other, and there's some really sus shit in there if you look for it. It's not hard to find pro-capitalist arguments in the Bible that are difficult to dispute without questioning biblical inerrancy. But that's not what PragerU even does here. And this is what confused me about this video, and about Prager's religious content in general. It's all just so bad, so obviously dishonest, so easily debunked, that I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out who their audience was. Most leftists don't give two shits about whether Jesus agreed with them, and most Christians, conservative or otherwise, would immediately spot the dishonest ways this channel uses biblical texts. So who are they trying to convince? Then someone in the Dank Left Discord chat made a comment that kind of snapped it all into perspective. I'm 90% sure they're targeting those who watch gaming videos or are just getting into left-wing politics. The gaming means that they're indirectly targeting, on purpose, 10 to 15-year-olds, who at that point mostly haven't read the Bible to know it's misquoted, and are malleable enough to listen to PragerU without a second thought and give religion a lot of credit. If you're watching YouTube to watch Minecraft videos, people in that demographic don't have strongly formed opinions, and PragerU hits them just right, especially when they're arguing against something and not for something most of the time. I think this hits the nail on the head. This is who Prager is after. The same kids who watch Gamergate videos and feminist takedown videos and PewDiePie. They might not seem like they're connected because these are a bunch of conservative, old, boring white guys, but they're explicitly on the outer edge of the same fascist radicalization pipeline, and they know it. They don't try to formulate their content to target evangelical conservatives, even though that's their stated demographic of interest. Instead, they formulate these dumbed-down, meme-ready versions of the evangelical conservative position that most adults of either political persuasion would find ridiculous. But it's perfect for kids and young adults who are still building their identities and are primed to accept things that they sound like could be used to own the libs. Of course, once they go out and try these arguments in the wild, they're gonna get torn apart. But that'll only drive them deeper into the arms of their new, increasingly fascist community. PragerU doesn't care about spreading conservative values per se. It's not trying to convince leftists or provide conservatives with good ammunition against the left. It's a fascist recruiting tool, intended to target kids currently in the process of being radicalized. It's meant to facilitate an intermediate step between reactionary gamer and alt-right loon. And that makes it just as dangerous as it is stupid.